At the mouth of the great river Rhoyne, where the water finally surrenders to the summer sea, stands the oldest of the free cities. It is the proudest, and by some measures still the most populous, of all the city-states that survived the fall of the Valyrian Freehold. The Volantines call it the first daughter, though most of the world simply calls it Old Volantis. Volantis was not founded by merchants or settlers seeking a new life, but rather it started as a simple Valyrian garrison. The Valyrian Freehold was the most powerful civilization the world had ever seen. An empire of dragon riders who had spent centuries conquering everything within reach, from the ruins of the old empire of Geese in the east to the shores of the known world's western edges. Where other empires built their power on armies and walls, Valyria built its on dragons, and that difference made it effectively unstoppable. When the Freehold decided it wanted something, it sent dragon lords to take it, and nothing in the world at that time was capable of saying no. After the Valyrian Freehold destroyed the old empire of Geese and began expanding its reach westward, it planted Volantis at the southernmost tip of that expansion, at the eastern mouth of the Rhoyne, as a military outpost to protect the edges of the Freehold's growing territory. For roughly the first 100 years of its existence, the settlement was little more than soldiers and walls. Specifically, the great oval of fused black dragonstone that the Volantines still call the Black Walls, raised 200 feet high, wide enough at the top for 6 4-horse chariots to ride abreast. Those walls were not built to impress, but to hold. What transformed Volantis from a garrison into a city was trade. The Rhoyne was the greatest river in the known world, and the Valyrian lords who used Volantis as a base quickly recognized that its position at the river's mouth made it an extraordinary commercial hub. Wealthy Valyrians began pouring money into the settlement, exploiting the trade routes running north along the Rhoyne to the Rhoynar city-states above. Settlements spread on both sides of the river. The construction of the Long Bridge, that enormous structure that still joins the eastern and western halves of the city today, was begun under a Triarch named Valasso, who is remembered by the title the Munificent. In time, Volantis grew powerful enough to rival its neighbours along the river, and the competition between the rising Valyrian colony and the ancient Rhoynar cities became a source of increasing tension. The Rhoynar were an old civilization, proud of their river and their independence. Their cities, Croyan, Nisar, Sarmel, Sarhoy, and others, stretched the length of the Rhoyne, and they had their own magic, their own culture, and their own gods. The ancient port city of Sarhoy sat at the westernmost mouth of the Rhoyne, its canals and saltwater gardens a direct rival to Volantis's own harbour at the easternmost mouth. As Valyrian settlements pushed further up the river, founding towns at Volantis and Valissar, reaching toward the Selhoru tributary, the Rhoynar saw themselves surrounded. Disputes between the growing Valyrian presence and the Rhoynar city-states became more frequent and more violent, eventually giving birth to a long series of short but brutal wars. These conflicts stretched over roughly 2.5 centuries and earned the name the Rhoynish Wars. The Valyrian colonies aided one another when under pressure, and when matters became truly desperate, they called upon the dragon lords of the Freehold itself, a resource the Rhoynar could never match. The Rhoynish cities, for their part, were fiercely independent and rarely fought as a united force, which meant they were consistently outmatched when the full weight of Valyria was brought to bear. The wars came to a head in what is called the Second Spice War. Volantis called upon 3 Valyrian dragon lords, and together they fell upon the great Rhoynar port of Sarhoy, overwhelmed it, burned it to the ground, and sowed the ruins with salt to ensure the city could never be rebuilt. Every citizen was killed or taken into slavery. It was a deliberate, total erasure, the kind of destruction meant to send a message to everyone who remained. The message was received, though not in the way Volantis intended. Prince Garin of Croyan, the greatest of the Rhoynish cities, looked at the smoking ruins of Sarhoy and understood that patience was no longer an option. He called upon his fellow Rhoynar princes to join him in a great alliance, declared that Valyria meant to consume them entirely, and succeeded in uniting all 5 remaining Rhoynish city-states under his command. What followed was, by any account, one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in the history of Essos. Garren put a weapon into the hands of every man, woman, and child old enough to hold one. The army he assembled was said to be 250,000 strong, the largest land force Essos had ever seen. Marching south along the Rhoyne, he won his first victory at Selhoris, and Valisar fell the same way. At Volantis, he found himself facing 100,000 enemies, 100 war elephants, and 3 dragons. Rhoynish water wizards raised enormous waterspouts against the foe's dragons, and all 3 were defeated. In the aftermath, the river itself seemed to rise in answer. Mother Rhoyne, as the Rhoynish called her, swallowed much of Volantis in a flood. Garren was named Garren the Great, and it is recorded that in Volantis, great lords trembled behind their black walls as his host advanced. Volantis did not face him in the field, but sealed its gates and sent an urgent appeal to the Freehold, which answered with 300 dragons. No army of flesh and water magic survives 300 dragons. Garren's host was shattered outside Volantis, and it is said, the blood of the Rhoynar turned the great harbour red as far as the eye could see. Garren himself was captured and placed in a golden cage, then carried north along the Rhoyne so that he could witness the destruction of his own city, Croyan, and the enslavement of his people. The surviving Rhoynish cities were sacked one by one, their populations enslaved. Princess Nymeria of Nysar, who had counselled against the war from the beginning, gathered the survivors, most of them women and children, onto every ship and barge that could still sail. She led them west down the Rhoyne, deliberately taking the westernmost mouth of the river near the ruins of Sarhoy, to avoid the Volantine fleet, and passed out into the summer sea. That great exodus became known as the 10,000 ships, and it ended, after years of wandering, on the shores of Dawn. For Volantis, the victory was total. The Rhoynar were broken and gone. The river was Valyrian from its headwaters to its mouth, and Volantis sat at the end of it, rich, protected, and the favoured daughter of the greatest power in the known world. Yet for all their power, the Valyrian Freehold's dominance was not eternal. Centuries later, a cataclysm at their very heart would bring their golden age to a fiery end. In the year 102 BC, around 600 years following the end of the Rhoynish Wars, a catastrophe known as the Doom of Valyria came without warning. A cataclysm of volcanic fire that consumed the Freehold cities, killed its dragon lords, and erased the greatest civilization the world had ever known in the space of a single day. What remained of its vast reach were the outlying colonies it had planted across Essos over centuries of expansion, scattered city-states that had thrived under the Freehold's protection and now found themselves suddenly and completely alone. Of all those surviving cities, none were better positioned to claim the Freehold's inheritance than Volantis, the oldest of the daughters, the first colony, the city that had stood longest in Valyria's name. The black walls of Volantis had been raised by the Freehold itself, while its noble families could trace their blood directly back to Old Valyria. And at the moment when the doom struck, Volantis was by every measure the mightiest of the free cities. The ruling faction in Volantis at the time were men who became known as the Tigers, the old blood aristocracy, the warriors and conquerors who believed that Volantis had not merely survived the doom, but been chosen by it. In their view, Valyria had designated Volantis as its heir, simply by leaving it standing. The other free cities were fellow daughters of the Freehold, yes, but daughters who needed to be gathered back under one roof. The Tigers held sway in Volantis for nearly the entire century of blood, and they drove the city into the most ambitious military campaign it had ever attempted: the reconstruction of the Valyrian Empire, with Volantis at its centre. Volantine fleets and armies moved against Lys and Myr, at first with considerable success, taking control of both cities and holding them for roughly 2 generations, long enough that the Tiger's confidence seemed, for a time, justified. With 2 of the free cities under its rule and command of the southern reaches of the Rhoyne, Volantis had achieved what the Tigers had always argued was its destiny: the first steps toward reconstructing the Freehold's lost empire, and the momentum seemed unstoppable. Then Volantis turned its attention to Tyrosh, and the entire edifice began to fracture. Tyrosh resisted, and its resistance gave the rest of Essos the time it needed to make a decision. Pentos came to Tyrosh's aid, while Lys and Myr, long resentful of Volantine rule, rose in open rebellion. The Sea Lord of Braavos, whose city had been founded by escaped slaves and harboured no love for Valyrian imperialism in any form, sent 100 ships to aid the Lyseni. Qohor and Norvos formed their own alliance and moved against the Volantine fleet that controlled the Rhoyne, destroying much of it at Dagger Lake. What had begun as Volantis against its rivals had become, through the sheer scale of Volantine ambition, Volantis against nearly the entire known world. It was at this point that Pentos and Tyrosh made the approach that would prove decisive. They sent envoys to Dragonstone, the small island fortress off the coast of Westeros, where the last surviving Valyrian dragon lords, House Targaryen, had made their seat, and the Lord of Dragonstone at the time, a young man named Aegon Targaryen, agreed to intervene. Aegon rode his dragon Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest dragon the world had seen since the height of Valyria, first to Pentos to meet with its prince and magisters, and then to Lys, where a Volantine fleet was assembling in the harbour with the intention of retaking the city and crushing the rebellion. Balerion's fire burned the fleet, and with it burned the last real prospect of a Volantine victory, after which Aegon returned to Dragonstone to pursue his own ambitions elsewhere. The reversal was swift and catastrophic for Volantis, whose fleets continued to suffer defeats across every theatre of the war. The Dothraki, who had been spreading across the eastern plains since the Doom removed the only force capable of checking them, began raiding Volantis's eastern territories, striking at a city that was already stretched and weakened. Around the same time, Volantis sent a fleet of its own south toward the ruins of Old Valyria, hoping to claim whatever wealth or power might remain on the shattered peninsula. But the fleet sailed into the smoking sea and was never seen again. The city that had once been the mightiest of the free cities had been bled white, its armies ground down and its fleet burned, scattered, or swallowed by the smoking sea. While at home the faction that had driven all of this, the Tigers, found itself losing the argument it had been making for nearly a century. The elephants, the merchants and moneylenders, who had always favoured trade over conquest, had spent the century of blood watching their city's wealth and manpower drain away in service of a dream the Tigers could never deliver. When the wars finally ended in defeat, it was the elephants who took power. Their followers went through the city in a rage, knocking the heads from the statues of the Triarchs and nobles they held responsible for the bloodshed. It was a settling of accounts that had been building for generations. What emerged from the wreckage was a diminished city, not destroyed, not poor, but diminished. The wars had taken a toll on Volantis's population that it never fully recovered from. Large stretches of what had once been thriving districts were abandoned, their buildings sinking slowly back into the river mud. The city that had ruled Lys and Myr for 2 generations watched Braavos, a city founded by escaped slaves and not even a true daughter of Valyria, grow to rival and eventually surpass it in wealth and influence. The aggressive Tigers had gambled the first daughter's future on 1 century of war, and now the merchants who inherited the ruins will have to spend the next 3 centuries paying the bill. The free city of Volantis is known by many names, such as the first daughter of Valyria, being the first colony established by the Valyrian Freehold. The city is also called Mighty Volantis, being the grandest and most populous of the 9 free cities, and Beautiful Volantis, the city of fountains and flowers. But the city that a traveller actually walks through in the current age is a place where large districts stand half empty, where the marks of depopulation from wars fought centuries ago have never been fully repaired. Its reputation and its reality have long since parted company, and the gap between them is visible in the streets themselves, in the dry fountains, the cracked pools, and the roofless temples slowly sinking back into the river mud. The city divides cleanly in two, and the division is not merely geographical. The Rhoyne runs through it, and on the eastern bank stands Old Volantis, the original city, the garrison, the heart of everything the Volantines claim to be. At the centre of the eastern bank sit the Black Walls, that great oval of fused dragonstone raised by the Valyrian Freehold, 200 feet into the air, wide enough at the top for 6 4-horse chariots to race abreast. In fact, they do race around it every year to mark the founding of the city. Inside those walls is a labyrinth of palaces, courtyards, towers, temples, cloisters, and cellars, all of it belonging exclusively to the families of the old blood. No slave, freedman, or foreigner is permitted inside the Black Walls, unless personally invited by one of the noble families within. The old gods of Valyria are still observed behind those walls, kept alive in shrines and temples by an aristocracy that measures its worth in the unbroken length of its bloodline. The Black Walls are not simply a fortification, but a statement, an insistence, maintained in stone harder than steel, that something of Valyria still exists, and that it lives here. Connecting the eastern city to the western bank is the Long Bridge, the longest bridge in the known world, and one of the 9 wonders made by man, as named by the traveller Lomas Longstrider. Its construction under Triarch Valasso, the Munificent, took more than 40 years. The bridge is wide enough for 2 wagons to pass side by side, and its length is so great that crossing it in heavy traffic can take hours. What makes the Long Bridge remarkable is not simply its scale, but what has been built upon it. Over the centuries, shops, temples, taverns, brothels, and Sivas parlours have risen on both sides of the roadway, their upper floors overhanging the lower ones until they almost touch across the bridge's width. Walking its length in the torchlit evenings feels less like crossing a river and more like passing through a covered market suspended above open water, where weavers and glassblowers sell their wares alongside fishwives and candlemakers. The eastern gateway is an arch of black dragonstone carved with sphinxes, manticores, and dragons. And across the Long Bridge from the east is the western bank, which is a different city entirely, louder, denser, and more chaotic, the part of Volantis that grew up after the initial garrison as trade and population expanded, and the part that most visitors actually experience. Foreigners are generally confined to the western districts, and the waterfront there teems with merchants, sailors, and the constant traffic of one of the great ports of the known world. The Hathay, a small ornate cart pulled by a dwarf elephant, driven by a slave with a wheel tattooed on his cheek, moves through the western streets as the standard conveyance for anyone of means, and walking is considered beneath the dignity of respectable Volantines. Those hierarchies are built on a foundation of slavery so extensive that it defines nearly every aspect of daily life in Volantis, where for every free person in the city, there are 5 slaves who fill every occupation the city requires, from cleaning the streets to staffing the temples. What distinguishes Volantis' slavery from that practiced elsewhere is the system by which slaves are publicly identified. Every slave has their face tattooed not merely to mark them, but to comprehensively identify them by profession. A slave soldier of the city guard wears jade-green tiger stripes across his cheeks. A prostitute, a single tear beneath the right eye. A fool or jester, squares of motley patterned from neck to scalp, and a red priest flames across the cheeks, chin, and forehead. The city does not allow its slaves to be anonymous, ensuring that each one carries their function on their face permanently, the social order of Volantis written on the bodies of the people who sustain it. This is the city that calls itself the first daughter of Valyria. The pride is not entirely hollow. The black walls are genuinely ancient. The long bridge is truly extraordinary, and the harbour of Volantis is, by any measure, one of the great commercial arteries of the known world. But the grandeur and the decay exist side by side in a way that the city's self-image does not quite accommodate. And the eastern bank in particular, where the old blood still live in their ancient palaces behind their ancient walls, carries the weight of centuries of loss in every crumbling district and every abandoned temple. The Volantines are proud of what they were, but less willing to look plainly at the distance between that and what they currently are. The system by which Volantis governs itself is one of the stranger arrangements in the known world, and it says a great deal about what the city believes itself to be. Volantis is not a kingdom and has no kings and princes. It is a freehold, the last surviving example of the system that once governed the Valyrian Empire itself. Power in Volantis is held collectively by all freeborn landowners, where every man or woman that owns land has the right to vote. The 3 rulers they elect, called Triarchs, serve for 1 year and are chosen entirely from among the noble families who can prove unbroken bloodline descent from Old Valyria, after which they stand for election again or step aside. The system is, by its own lights, a republic, though one with a very narrow definition of who matters and who does not. What makes the Triarchy function in practice is not the formal rules, but the 2 factions that have contested those elections for centuries. The Tigers are the party of the old blood aristocracy, the warriors and conquerors, the men and women who regard themselves as the rightful successors to the dragon lords of Valyria, and believe that Volantis should do what its ancestors did: expand, conquer, and dominate. The elephants are the party of the merchants and moneylenders, those whose power comes not from ancient blood, but from accumulated wealth, and who believe that Volantis grows strongest through trade and diplomacy rather than war. Both factions draw their actual candidates exclusively from old blood families, since only those who can prove Valyrian descent are permitted to stand as Triarch. However, the difference between a tiger and an elephant is not ancestry, but philosophy, and the argument between them has been running without final resolution for 300 years. The elections themselves are a spectacle unlike anything in Westeros, lasting 10 days during which Volantis transforms entirely. Torchlit marches fill the streets at night, candidates and their supporters give speeches throughout the city, and mummers and minstrels perform in the open plazas. Living elephants painted with the names of would-be Triarchs across their sides are paraded through the western districts. The bribery is open and understood by all, and no one in Volantis pretends the elections are purely about merit, yet the Volantines take them seriously regardless, preserving the form of a system inherited from Valyria itself, even when the substance is compromised. Once elected, the 3 Triarchs are considered to occupy a position so elevated that their feet are not permitted to touch the ground for the entire year of their service, carried everywhere by palanquin, or by the great grey elephants that serve as transportation for the city's wealthiest residents. The moment they take office, they are no longer entirely ordinary men and women, but symbols as much as rulers. By long-standing custom that has hardened into unwritten law, no more than 1 tiger may hold a Triarch position at any time. For much of the 3 centuries after the Century of Blood was concluded, at least 2 of the 3 have been elephants, and there have been years when no tiger held a seat at all. This system has enforced its own strange kind of equilibrium since the end of the Century of Blood. The Tigers have never been removed from the contest. Their faction still runs candidates, still wins a seat on occasion, but the disasters of the Century of Blood anchored a political reality that has never fully shifted. The city remembers what ambition cost it, and the merchants who rebuilt Volantis' wealth after the wars have not let go of the levers of power since. There is one episode from that transitional period that the historical record preserves with particular clarity, and it reveals something essential about the limits of the Triarchy's power in Volantis. Triarch Hrono was a tiger who had earned genuine admiration from the city's people, with a record of being re-elected year after year for 40 consecutive years, a show of sustained popular support that no other Triarch in Volantis' history had come close to matching. But this made him complacent, and he eventually grew tired of standing for election. Hrono declared himself Triarch for life, and in doing so, made the most consequential political mistake in Volantene history. The city turned on him almost immediately, the Volantines unwilling, whatever their other views, to watch their freehold become a monarchy. Rioters seized Hrono from his palanquin, a man who for 4 decades had not been permitted to touch the ground, stripped him of his titles, tied him between 2 living elephants, and tore him apart. His fate is recorded in the journals of a Volantene writer named Nisios Koheros. When the elephants later came fully to power, and their supporters swept through the streets, pulling down the statues of those they held responsible for the wars, Hrono's statue in the city of Selhoris lost its head along with the rest. Whether the tigers or the elephants hold the majority of the Triarch seats in any given year, the fundamental argument between them never really ends. The tigers have never stopped believing in what Volantis could be, and the elephants have never stopped believing that what Volantis is, carefully managed, is enough. Behind the black walls, the old blood still keeps the gods of Valyria. Old names, shrines, and offerings are still left at temples that most of the world has long since forgotten. It is a private faith, protected by stone walls and aristocratic pride, maintained as one more proof of an unbroken connection to the freehold that built this city. But the faith that actually dominates Volantis is not the one kept in those ancient palaces. It lives outside the walls, in the streets, and it belongs to R'hllor, the Lord of Light, the Heart of Fire, the God of Flame and Shadow. Throughout the known world, there is no city where that flame burns with more fervour than in Volantis, and no building better represents that intensity than the temple that stands just outside the black walls along the Eastern River Road. The Temple of the Lord of Light in Volantis is, by the reckoning of Archmaester Gramion, roughly 3 times the size of the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing. It is an enormity of pillars and towers that flow into one another, as though the whole structure had been carved from a single, colossal rock. Compared to the black walls nearby, which are cold and impassive and speak of military power, the temple announces itself as something else entirely. A place of fire and mass devotion, built to hold an audience rather than exclude one. That distinction matters enormously in Volantis, because the faith of R'hllor found its deepest roots not among the free people of the city, but among its slaves. R'hllor's theology is built around a cosmic conflict between light and darkness, and the promise that the Lord of Light will ultimately prevail. For a population owned entirely by another person, with no legal standing and no prospect of liberation through the city's political process, that promise carried an appeal that few other faiths could match. R'hllor did not come to Volantis' slaves as an imposed religion, but as a comfort, and it stayed as a conviction. The temple itself operates on the same principles of ownership and labour that govern the rest of the city. All who serve within it, the priests, the soldiers, the prostitutes, are slaves, bought as children and raised entirely within the faith. They are slaves of R'hllor, which is also one of the formal titles held by Benero, the temple's high priest, who's also known as the Flame of Truth, Light of Wisdom, and First Servant of the Lord of Light. That the leader of the greatest religious institution in Volantis formally styles himself a slave is not an act of humility so much as a statement of doctrine. In the theology of R'hllor, every living person is ultimately in service to the god. The military force that protects the temple is known as the Fiery Hand, and it maintains a fixed strength of exactly 1,000 slave soldiers, never more and never less. They wear ornate armor over orange robes and carry spears whose points have been forged in the shape of writhing flames. Like the priests they guard, the soldiers of the Fiery Hand are marked with flame tattoos, though where the priests carry flames across their cheeks, chin and forehead, the soldiers of the Hand bear them across their cheeks alone. Their presence gives the temple something no other religious institution in Volantis possess: its own standing army, loyal not to the Triarchs, but to the faith, and a source of considerable anxiety for the city's rulers. In the year 300 AC, which is when the events of A Dance with Dragons unfold, the political weight of the temple had become one of the most volatile forces in Volantis. The high priest Benero preaches every night from a red stone pillar connected to the temple's lofty terrace by a slender bridge, addressing enormous crowds of slaves and freedmen who pack the plaza below. Benero is a gaunt, pale-skinned man, red flame tattoos covering his cheeks, chin, and shaved head. It is said that he is capable of drawing fire from his very fingers, tracing burning Valyrian glyphs in the air above his congregation, letters that those who know the language can read as words like doom and darkness. He is able to draw crowds large and volatile enough to resemble, in the words of one observer, the moments before a full riot. What Benero is preaching is explosive. He proclaims that Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen in Meereen, is Azor Ahai reborn. The messianic figure central to R'hllor's theology, the hero of flame prophesied to deliver the world from darkness. And he warns the Triarchs directly and in public that Volantis will burn if they take up arms against her. The slave population listens to these sermons with a fervour that terrifies the ruling class behind the black walls. And given that slaves outnumber free people in Volantis 4-1, the Triarchs understand clearly what a slave uprising would mean. Not a riot, but the end of Volantis as it has existed for centuries. The Triarch's fear of Benero is sharpened by a particular piece of political arithmetic. Roughly half of the Tiger Cloaks, the slave soldiers who make up the city guard, worship R'hllor. Triarch Malakwo Magir, a tiger who favours war against Daenerys, attempts to hire the Golden Company to remove Benero by the sword and clear out the temple. But the sellswords refuse, leaving Malakwo without a clean move. His own city guard split in its loyalties, the temple in possession of 1,000 soldiers of its own, and the high priest continuing to preach to crowds that continue to grow. The faith of R'hllor did not set out to become a political force in Volantis, but became one, because the conditions of the city made it inevitable. When 4 out of every 5 people in a city are owned by the other one, and a religion rises among the owned that preaches fire, liberation, and the coming destruction of those who have turned away from the light, the question of whether that religion is political answers itself. In the year 300 AC, the Iron Fleet of the Iron Islands passes through Volantis under the command of Victarion Greyjoy, Lord Captain of the fleet, and younger brother to the infamous Euron Greyjoy. The Iron Fleet isn't there for trade, and are sailing east to Meereen on Euron's orders, tasked with bringing Daenerys Targaryen back to Westeros as Euron's bride. The city that Victarion stops in briefly for provisions is barely recognizable from the orderly, merchant-ruled environment maintained by the elephants for 300 years. The political situation has now flipped, with the tigers ascendant and the elephants outvoted or bought. Sailors, soldiers, and tinkers are dancing in the streets with nobles and fat merchants. And in every inn, wine-sink cups are being raised to the newly elected Triarchs. All the talk is of the gold, gems, and slaves that will flood back into Volantis once the Dragon Queen is dead. A fleet of somewhere between 300 and 500 ships has already been dispatched towards Slavers Bay, its war galleys loaded with slave soldiers and the accumulated ambition of a city that has been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity for 300 years. Beneath the celebrations and the war fever, however, a different current is running. The slaves of Volantis have their own understanding of what Daenerys Targaryen represents, and the Temple of the Lord of Light has given that understanding a voice. The widow of the waterfront, whose tear tattoos were cut from her face when she was freed, gives Jorah Mormont and Tyrion Lannister a message to carry with them to Meereen. A message not from the Triarchs, or the merchants, or the old blood, but from the city's slave majority. Tell her we are waiting. Tell her to come soon. The Volantis we leave behind is a city pulled in two directions at once. Its ruling class committed to a war against the Dragon Queen, Daenerys Targaryen, and its slave majority quietly counting on her as the prophesized Messiah. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the captivating city of Volantis. Be sure to subscribe if you want to uncover more lore from the world of Game of Thrones. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.